The legend of St. Brendan the Navigator has been told in Ireland for countless generations. It was the 6th century, and Europe was deep in the shadows of the Dark Ages. Yet, this was Ireland's golden age, when the light of learning shone from great monasteries and from the pages of magnificently illuminated manuscripts. In the centuries to come, Ireland's courageous missionaries would carry the Christian message throughout Europe. But one holy abbot named Brendan surpassed all others in his travels. He was a native of Kerry, here on Ireland's wild Atlantic seaboard. At a time when most people lived and died within a day's walk of their birthplace, he led a life of high adventure that took him to the furthest corners of the known world, and possibly well beyond. In a traditional Irish boat of skin and wood, beset by the perils of 6th century seafaring, this holy man journeyed throughout Dark Age Europe, northwards as far as Scandinavia, and south along the coasts of France and Spain, even Africa. And so he became known as Brendan the Navigator. But some say Brendan's greatest adventure was still to come. The venerable abbot was already well advanced in years when a mysterious monk came to visit him at his great abbey in Galway. He told Brendan of an island in the west, a place he called the land God promised to the saints. It was, he said, the earthly paradise of which the Bible speaks, where the trees are fruitful and the sun always shines. When Brendan heard the old man's tale, he knew that if it were God's will, he would find it. And so Brendan and his brother monks built a boat in the traditional manner of the Irish, with the hides of oxen stretched over a frame of wood and sealed with animal fats and beeswax.
Then Brendan ordered his brothers in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit to enter the boat. The sail was set, and they began to steer westwards into the summer solstice.
On their long journey through the rough and uncharted waters of the North Atlantic, the monks were said to have had many bizarre and fantastic experiences. Not long after their journey had begun, an enormous, glistening white pillar appeared in the sea before them, to the great astonishment of the brothers. One day, they landed on a strange island to prepare a meal.
When the brothers were plying the fire with wood, the island began to be in motion like a wave. The brothers rushed to the boat, crying out to Brendan for protection.
Later, they discovered the stark and forbidding Island of the Blacksmiths. Here, giants hurled enormous hot coals from their furnaces, which hissed in the sea around the terrified monks. After many years at sea, the monks found themselves enveloped in a mysterious fog. Then, the voice of an angel spoke to Brendan, saying the land they were seeking was now close at hand. And so, the legends say, Brendan and his crew became the first men to set eyes upon the land God promised to the saints.
On disembarking, they saw a wide land full of trees bearing fruit as in autumn time. And so for the space of 40 days, they reconnoitered that land and could find no end to it. But one day, an angel came to them, saying, "There before you lies the land which you have sought for a long time. You could not find it immediately because God wanted to show you the secrets of the great ocean. Return then to the land of your birth, bringing with you some of the fruit of this land."
And so Brendan returned to his abbey in Ireland, where the story of his miraculous journey would be written down for all time. Ten years before his own historic journey, Christopher Columbus came to Brendan's Abbey searching for clues to the mystery. Did 6th century Irish monks discover America? How could they have made such a voyage? And perhaps more intriguing still, why? To understand why Brendan would have undertaken such a perilous quest, we must look to the tradition of early Christian monks. They went alone into the wilderness, seeking a life away from the rest of the human race, in Europe's wildest, most inaccessible places, to be close to God.
There were two kinds of monks. There were the monks who lived in big monasteries, kind of universities of the day, but then there were the people who sought solitude, loneliness in the islands of the Atlantic, like Skellig, which is 8 miles off the coast of Ireland, where they lived in little beehive cells, meditating. It's possible they didn't live all year round in a lonely, desperately isolated, with no resources like that. Though there are eggs and birds available for eating there. So they were by no means emaciated and hungry.
Nowhere was their sacrifice more dramatic than in Ireland. Living on the edge of Europe, at the last landfall of the known world, the Irish monks were surrounded by the greatest wilderness of them all, the Atlantic Ocean. It was on the edge of this great ocean, around the year 483, that Brendan was born into a seafaring tribe. So his early life was filled with stories of the sea. But Brendan's early life was also filled with love for his God. As a young man, he came to Ardfert Abbey, where St. Erc, the local bishop and holy man, educated the young Brendan in the ways of the church. In his teens, Brendan began to travel on foot throughout Ireland. It is said he came here, to the Aran Islands, to study with Enda, a mighty warrior and one of the wisest and holiest teachers of the age. But the ocean was in Brendan's blood. And once he'd finished his education, the young monk launched himself upon a life of pilgrimage by sea. At a time when only the very hardy put to sea at all, Irish monks were carrying stories and ideas from one community to another. both the missionaries and newspapers of the Dark Ages. And Brendan surpassed them all. Abbeys as far afield as Africa and Scotland claim him as their founder. Putting to sea in Brendan's day was a dangerous business. Vessels were small, and seafaring confined for the most part to hugging the shore. After all, according to the charts of the day, beyond the western horizon lay sea monsters and the edge of the world.
By our standards, I think they were very brave men, but by the standards of that time, they did not see that as bravery. They were so tied up with the whole enthusiasm of being monks or being pilgrims and servants of God, as in the Bible. That was their inspiration. So it's wrong for us, I think, to judge them as brave men. They were just average, very holy men, ascetics, completely committed men of their time.
And yet, Brendan's last and boldest journey would take him into these uncharted waters, where people believed certain death awaited. No accounts survive of Brendan's early adventures, but we do have a written record of his last and greatest voyage. Written in the 8th century, but based on versions of the legend from close to Brendan's own time, it is called the Navigatio Sancti Brendani Abbatis, the Voyage of St. Brendan the Abbot. If the tale it tells is true, the history of the Western world needs to be rewritten. The Navigatio claims to tell the full story of Brendan's great voyage. It is said he took a group of monks to a place on the western coast, now called Brendan's Creek, where they fasted to prepare their spirits. And then they built the boat that would carry them to paradise. Fascinated by the saga of Brendan's voyage, in 1976, the explorer Tim Severin used the specifications detailed in the ancient manuscript to build a precise replica of Brendan's boat, then attempted to retrace the monks' remarkable journey.
For a very long time it's been the question of whether St. Brendan's Navigatio, the story of his journey, is based on reality or is entirely imaginary. And I thought I would put it to a practical test. And I went to the west coast of Ireland to look at the descendant boats, the currachs, which are still used on the west coast, and seem to have followed the pattern, the design of the boats that date back to the time of St. Brendan. So I had to begin by building a vessel as closely as possible to the specifications laid down in the St. Brendan story, by using a boat made of leather, the right type of leather, the correct medieval type of leather, sewed it together with medieval style of thread.
A year later, Severin and his crew stunned the world by landing their ancient craft on the shores of Newfoundland.
We're just here in the harbour. Fire up. George, we're taking out now. We got George.
Tim Severin's experiment proved one thing decisively. The boat described in the Navigatio could have made the treacherous transatlantic crossing. The question is, did it? In the 6th century, no living person had ever ventured so far out to sea. People believed this was the realm of great dragons and monsters. What Brendan and his companions would find, no one had ever seen before. The voyage of St. Brendan was primarily a pilgrimage. The Navigatio is a journey of the soul, not a ship's log. Yet sprinkled through the colourful text are extraordinary descriptions of regions visited and islands discovered that perhaps today help prove that remarkable document much more than mere fantasy. Either the author of the Navigatio, using only his imagination, accurately described sights no one had ever seen, or else the tradition that attributes the discovery of the New World to Christopher Columbus in 1492 is off by more than 1,000 years. How could a writer in the 8th century know what Brendan would find in the North Atlantic, at a time when, according to history, nobody had ever made that journey? Early in their voyage, Brendan and his followers were said to see an enormous, glistening pillar looming in the distance, like a floating mountain of pure white. But no Irish scribe of the day could have ever seen the giant icebergs of the North Atlantic. So where did that description come from? Then Brendan and his crew encounter the strange and forbidding island of the blacksmiths, where burning embers are hurled into the sea. And yet, however fanciful such a passage may seem, such a place exists, many miles northwest of Ireland. It is Iceland, land of volcanoes. That would put Brendan here, already a long way across the Atlantic. For a group of 6th century monks to have journeyed even this far is astonishing. But this was only the beginning.
The island began to be in motion like a wave. The brothers rushed to the boat, crying out to Brendan for protection. "My sons," said Brendan, "do not be afraid. We were not on an island, but on a fish."
Sailors today feel certain that the tale of the brothers beginning to cook a meal on Jasconius, most magnificent of all creatures that swim in the sea, could only be told by someone who had seen the great whales that migrate across the northern waters between Iceland and Greenland.
Whales play a great role in the story of St. Brendan. They come and visit him. Well, whales visited us frequently, I mean, in extraordinary numbers. I think because they thought that our skin-covered boat was perhaps some other sort of a whale, and they were curious about us.
Could it be that these 1,500-year-old tales are not as tall as they first appear? To be encountering whales, Brendan is already halfway across the Atlantic Ocean. Halfway, perhaps, to the promised land. After 7 years of wandering the treacherous waters of the North Atlantic, Brendan's mission seemed doomed. The Navigatio tells of the monks drifting, directionless, shrouded in a strange mist.
As the evening drew on, a great fog enveloped them, so that none of them could hardly see another. This was the fog that encircled the island they had been seeking for 7 years.
Fishermen out of St. John's in Newfoundland know this fog well. It descends on the Labrador banks to the north of their island home. Brendan and his crew had arrived at the promised land.
Disembarking, they saw a wide land full of trees bearing fruit as in autumn time. And so for the space of 40 days, they reconnoitered that land and could find no end to it.
Does this passage describe the mainland of the North American continent? Certainly, this is how the New World might have appeared 1,500 years ago. A land of abundance, an earthly paradise. And yet, if we had only this passage to go on, it would be too vague to prove the voyage was real. But following so many uncanny descriptions of their experiences crossing the North Atlantic, can we really be blamed for pausing and wondering, did this intrepid saint really reach America?
I certainly believe that Irish monks had the technology to get across the Atlantic. There's no question about that. We've shown that conclusively by our experiment. I believe that the similarity between the experiences that we had and those recounted in the story of St. Brendan. We sailed through dense fog off the tip of Greenland, and that is where St. Brendan is alleged on his journey to pass through a great thick cloud bank. We encountered icebergs as well. There are just too many similarities for it to be purely coincidence. One or two similarities, yes, but 8, 9, 10 in the correct sequence, the same things happening, the same experiences. This is, I don't think the laws of chance could explain that. I think the story of St. Brendan has to be based on real Irish voyaging, real experiences.
In the 1480s, still several years before his famous voyage, Columbus himself journeyed to Brendan's monastery to consult the ancient manuscript that contained the Navigatio. It could be that Columbus suspected he wasn't the first to venture west. And perhaps he wasn't.
Columbus himself believed in the Brendan story. Halfway across the Atlantic, Columbus orders his little fleet to heave to, and they consult a chart which is handed between the ships, because they feel that at that point they have reached the islands which St. Brendan had discovered. They were marked on Columbus's charts. So Columbus was actually expecting to find St. Brendan's Islands. In other words, he believed that St. Brendan had found somewhere.
Could it be that a group of 6th century monks, inspired by their great faith, had not only the will, but the way? The legend of St. Brendan the Navigator, one of the greatest seafaring sagas of all time. If true, it would mean that Christopher Columbus did not discover America. That a full 1,000 years before his voyage, a white-haired Irish saint, in a craft of wood and animal hides, sailed west into the sunset, with no maps or charts, only an unshakable faith that God would guide him across the great ocean, all the way to the promised land.